Ask and ye shall receive. I love a good tinfoil theory, and initially I wanted to talk about 3 here. I thought I'd be able to do that because there's not that much for any of them, but instead I found there's quite a lot to say about one and basically nothing for the other 2. So the bulk of this video will be about Theory 1, Larys Lives. Oh, and massive spoilers, by the way, for Fire and Blood and future seasons of House of the Dragon. And don't go telling me that calling this video Larys Lives is itself a spoiler because it implies Larys dies, because they all die. It's set 170 years before the main series starts. Anyway, the Larys Lives theory hinges on the weirdness surrounding his execution. As a reminder, Larys does not bother to defend himself when questioned by Kragan Stark, and then at the execution declines Kragan's explicit offer to go to the wall, choosing to die instead. In my previous episodes on Larys, I suggested that this was because life without the ability to hold power and play the Game of Thrones would not be worth living for Larys, and that his request to cut off his club foot so that he could finally be free of it implied that his disability was important for his character. All very English literature, Peel paragraph worthy, but today we're not interested in why the curtains are blue, today we're looking for conspiracy. The crucial factor in Larys' weird execution is what supposedly happens after his death. His body is given to the Silent Sisters, and only years later gets returned to Harrenhal. We're told that Kragan Stark decrees that his clubfoot be buried separately, but it goes missing. The fact that Craig is the one who gives the order is telling, because Craig was only hand for 1 day, the same day he is judge, jury, and executioner for Larys, so it's not surprising that his orders aren't followed to the letter when he's probably not around anymore to enforce them. Mushroom tells us the foot gets sold to a sorcerer for use in spells, but Gildane casts doubt on this theory by pointing out that the same thing supposedly happened to Prince Joffrey, which suggests stories getting mixed up by the sources. The suspicious thing is that this means Larys' body, once it's returned to Harrenhal, is no longer identifiable as Larys, seeing as it's just going to be bones by that point without the distinguishing feature of the clubfoot, which is a condition which affects the skeleton, so it would still be obvious that the bones were his, and more importantly, if they weren't. If Larys faked his death somehow, setting up an excuse for why his clubfoot wouldn't be attached to his bones is necessary to cover his tracks. I think this is what we're supposed to think about when we're told Larys asked it to be cut off and then it went missing. It's another of those 100 or so little asides in Fire and Blood that plant a little seed of doubt, like how maybe Daemon survived, or maybe Luke survived, or maybe there's dragon eggs in Winterfell, or maybe Cannibal was on Dragonstone before the Targaryens showed up. Stuff like that. So it's probably not intended as a clue that Larys lived, just a sort of mystery box with no answer. Ignoring that though, the question is, how could Larys possibly have faked his death? His execution was public, in front of Aegon III and his court, as well as Kragan Stark of course, the dozens of condemned who would then survive, and all 3 primary sources. Larys' head gets cut off, and then they're stuck on a pike outside the Red Keep. How could this possibly have been faked? Well, we have one other example in A Song of Ice and Fire of an execution that at first glance looks unfakeable, but through magical shenanigans is confirmed to be a trick. The burning of Mance Rayder. In that instance, Melisandre uses a glamour to disguise Mance as Rattleshire, and vice versa, so that they can pretend to kill Mance when actually they're killing Rattleshire. What evidence do we have though that Larys has access to anything magical? It's mostly about his possible half-sister Alys Rivers. Some fans believe that Alys is in fact Melisandre, and there are a lot of similarities between the two. The big one is that Alys is supposedly able to see visions in flames, which would be a very odd coincidence if it was made up by someone, whether Alys or one of our sources, and they just happened to land on an actual magical thing that is possible. I've also tried to figure out the timeline on Alys Rivers' pregnancy, and I don't think it's reasonable that she would be heavily pregnant with Aemon's baby by the time Sabitha Frey captures Harrenhal, because Aemon only shows up at the earliest about a month and a half into 130 AC, and there's a big gap between Alys being captured and their next dateable sighting, which is Aemon's death in the 5th month of that year. So Alys' heavily preggers way too early, which reminds me of Melisandre's shadow baby gestation period, which is much less than 9 months. Alternatively, of course, it could just be someone else's baby. Alys is also rumoured to be extremely old, but look much younger, which is probably true about Melisandre, and Aemon says that Alys sees much and more in her fires, which is the exact phrase Melisandre uses when people ask her what she sees. There's also a murky line between what is actual magic and what is just mummery with both. Melisandre acknowledges that a lot of her powers are illusory and based on pyrotechnics rather than pyromancy, while certain magical actions of Alys Rivers, like the head exploding of Sir Regis Groves, might just be a bloke with a sling, as Mushroom points out. Whether or not Alice actually is Melisandre though, the seeming similarities of some of their power sets might suggest to us that Alice, like Melisandre, has the ability to do glamours. If she does, she may be able to do for Larys what Melisandre did for Mance. Alice vanishes from the story after the Battle of the God's Eye mid-130, and doesn't show up again until late 132, when she's still in Harrenhal, raising an army of gutter knights. This gives her time to be able to get to King's Landing and back, particularly as she doesn't seem to start gathering her troops immediately, given how nobody hears about it until late 132. The connection between Larys and Alice is kind of vague. She might have been his wet nurse, and also maybe his sister, or possibly not, so that's kind of up in the air. But Larys having access to glamours, whether Alice is doing it for him or not, makes quite a bit of sense. For example, Larys' ability to vanish into the shadows after the fall of King's Landing is kind of weird, given that he has a very distinctive feature in his clubfoot. Consider that later on Orwell gets found out pretty quickly just by the fact that he can read and write, and that unlike Orwell, Larys has a massive bounty on his head, so everyone will be keeping an eye out for anyone with a suspicious limp. If Larys was glamoured, that would help. It could also mean that he could actually be Cheese, as Alice and Helena wouldn't recognise him if he was magically disguised, and would thus help explain why Cheese is never found, and solve the problem of every rat catcher in the keep supposedly knowing all the secret passageways. Finally, Larys does that weird blood oath at the Green Council, which is weird and vaguely magic-y. If we accept that Larys could have used a glamour to do a Mance Rattleshirt situation, the question then becomes, who would have swapped with him? It's hard to think of anyone who would willingly have accepted death. Giles Belgrave accepts death on the basis that a Kingsguard should not outlive his king, so it could be that one of the other 3 Kingsguard knights similarly sentenced would have been willing to die as well. But if it's an honour-based thing, then agreeing to a swap with Larys so he can get away while pretending to be you seems weird. However, if we look back at the Rattleshirt thing, that's kind of ridiculous too. When Rattleshirt is led out, he's smiling, but then he sees the pyre and realises that something's wrong. That Melisandre managed to get him to agree to all this without him thinking something's weird is pretty wild. But if that kind of thing is possible, why wouldn't it be for Larys? Let's say he tells the prospective swapper that if he says what Larys says, the whole line about cutting his foot off and so on, Craig Stark will take pity and spare him. If the swapper is as stupid as Rattleshirt, he might believe it up to the point when his head gets cut off. Who would be a good swapper for Larys then? Someone stupid, who has blindly followed his every order up until that point even though it has gotten him in great danger, but then suspiciously becomes a lot smarter when the executions begin. Someone like Perkin the Flea. Perkin the Flea has already been shown to be a puppet of Larys, even when Larys' orders involved raising Tristane Truefire to the throne despite this being complete madness. When Perkin gets arrested by Craig Stark, he protests that he's been pardoned for his crimes, which shows a certain naivety. Yet Gildane describes him as a cunning rogue, as he is seemingly the only one who realised that he could request to take the black and have his life spared. The way Mushroom and Gildane tell it, it seems like no one else thought of this option. It's also mighty convenient that he's the first in the execution order, meaning that everyone else gets spared. This would be beneficial to Larys Perkin, as it would allow him to fade more into the crowd later on. There's even the line that Perkin is hauled to his feet by Craig's men, which means no one would notice him struggling to get to his feet due to having a disguised clubfoot. Now, if you believe that Larys faked his death, there's 1,000,001 things he could have done after his fake execution. Perhaps he went to Harrenhal to help Alice Rivers with her magical insurrection, which we still don't know the end of since Fire and Blood Part 2 hasn't come out yet. Perhaps he hung around the Red Keep, tormenting Alicent, bumping off the regents, or just generally being a nuisance. Since there's so much that he could have done, we won't cover every possibility, just one that I find kind of interesting. What if he wrote the Testimony of Mushroom? Now, I'm not saying Mushroom isn't real, though I do quite enjoy the theory that he's just Septon Eustace's alter ego. Just that the unnamed scribe who recorded Mushroom's testimony could have been Larys. My main argument for this is something I've mentioned before, that there's a lot of stuff in Fire and Blood which there is no possible source for. For example, the battle between Aemond and Daemon. The only person around other than them is Alice Rivers, a fact that is expressly stated by Gildane, Aemond, and Daemon. So the source for this must be Alice Rivers, but how on earth did that make its way into the history books? Perhaps through Larys, adding it to Mushroom's testimony. Blood and Cheese also has way too much detail. Mushroom is the only one of our sources to give an account, including referring to Cheese as Cheese, which might be why history remembers him that way. The Son for a Son's story includes detailed quotes, and even depicts Cheese's accent, which is very odd. The only possible sources for this are Blood's tortured confessions, Helena, or Alicent, none of whom I can imagine putting on funny voices. Perhaps this could be Larys enjoying telling about one of his great performances. Mushroom has loads of magical Alice Rivers-based information that it doesn't make sense he would actually have, and is the one to point out that Sir Regis may have been killed by a sling, even though as Gildane notes he was hundreds of leagues away. Then there's times that Mushroom does things that don't make sense, like repeating the rumour of the brothel queens when he's supposed to be a big Rhaenyra fan, and portrays her as sensitive and caring in other situations rather than cruel and callous. He has a go at Larys Strong and calls him Broken Bones, as well as spreading the rumour at the time that Rhaenyra's kids are bastards, which again is weird when he's supposed to be a Rhaenyra supporter, until you consider the possibility that Larys is writing this down and encouraging Mushroom to go after the brother he disliked enough to kill. Mushroom has information that seems legit even when he's not around, knowing about Aegon II's bastards and what he was up to the night Viserys died, the fact that Beesbury spoke out at the Green Council, Larys and Corlys exchanging a look in Aegon's final council meeting. That could have all been provided by Larys. It's also funny to me to imagine Mushroom having a go at Larys when he sat there in the room writing it all down, because Mushroom really doesn't like Larys, and the feeling is probably mutual given Larys is probably the target of mockery by Mushroom, may have tried to have him killed during the murder of Aegon, and when he failed, Mushroom gave testimony in the trial. The dynamic is a bit like Littlefinger and Tyrion's like that, constantly getting in each other's way and trying to kill each other. I like to think that Larys sought Mushroom out to kill him to get revenge, and found that Mushroom was looking for someone to write down his life story. Larys, probably in disguise, thinks why not, and does it for him, happily jotting down Mushroom's slander of him, which seems pretty in character to me, as Larys probably likes to have a reputation as a scumbag. I could go on, but we're at risk of making this another two-parter. Luckily, the other two theories are more bite-sized, so let's begin with the Larys Maester conspiracy. What makes me think Larys is working with the Maesters? Well, I don't. But if I did, the first thing I'd point to is Grand Maester Melos's bizarre allegation that Viserys killed Lionel and Harwin Strong, when it's so obvious that it was Larys. Melos was too afraid to admit in writing that Rhaenyra's kids were bastards when everyone knew that, but he's idly musing that the king murdered his hand. It's so weird that there has to be something going on, and perhaps the something is that Melos is covering for Larys. Perhaps Larys was among the selection of younger men Melos had suggested to Viserys as replacements for Lionel. Orwell could have been Daemon's spy for a son, working with Larys in an effort to divide the Greens and Blacks further and make them continue fighting each other to wipe out the dragons. It's not much, but something to puzzle over. Finally, was Larys innocent all along? This is more of a headcanon, because it's the idea that Fire and Blood has scapegoated him as evil because he's disabled, and in actual fact he was just a Green supporter doing his best to help them the whole time, and the slander of him is because Orwell, who wrote a lot of this history, is trying to cover up the fact that he is Daemon's spy on the small council and was a secret Black supporter. After all, they don't execute him like they do everyone else, and he's wily enough to be able to escape at the end of the dance. In this reading, Larys' refusal to defend himself to Craig and Stark seems more like resignation, as Perk and the Flea and Orwell both furiously pin their actions on him as a convenient scapegoat. Reminds me even more of Tyrion realising that he will get no justice at his trial, but whereas he reacts with anger, Larys reacts with acceptance. Like I said, both those two are bite-sized compared to the first one. Of course, if Larys lives and he has some magical shenanigans, perhaps he could still be around in the main series, like how some people think Alice could be Melisandre. Tell me in the comments who is secretly Larys in the year 300. Most outlandish yet compelling answer wins 10 points. Until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.